Next on Secrets of War. From primitive balloons to supersonic spy planes and amazingly sophisticated satellites. They are the ultimate intelligence resource. Their photos can radically change the course of battle. An inside look at the pioneers of aerial reconnaissance, their top secret programs, and the profound impact these images have had on modern warfare. Spies in the Sky is next on Secrets of War.
Every morning, top-secret intelligence photos land on the desks of world leaders and military planners around the globe. In wartime, they can change the course of a battle, ensuring a speedy victory and saving countless lives. In peacetime, the intelligence they carry is the first line of defense, revealing hostile intent. One good photograph inside the enemy camp can be worth 1,000 spies.
Anything that can be perceived by the eye will always provide that vital is seeing is believing factor. Yes, you can interrogate a prisoner. Yes, you can look at a document, but in both cases they could be false.
The invention of aerial photography has been likened to the invention of gunpowder. As firearms revolutionized warfare, aerial photography forever changed the art of spying. Surveillance systems are designated black projects, shrouded in secrecy. A network of land, air, and sea-based sensors allows commanders to spy not only over the hill, but far beyond the horizon. Spy planes soar higher and faster to evade detection and give the pilot greater safety. Aerial surveillance cameras have been developed to focus closer and closer on their targets.
If you, for example, can say initially that you see a tank, then the analysts want you to say, well, what sort of tank is it? And then what sort of wheels has it got? So there has been an increasing demand all the time for higher quality in terms of the interpretability or the definition.
Behind sealed windows, photo interpreters decipher odd shapes and shadows, piecing together minute clues to form a highly detailed, intelligent picture. With spy photography, intimate details of a foreign culture fall open to close investigation.
I've never been to your hometown, but I'm looking down. I've drawn a circle. Okay, I can say they're meat eaters. I can see cattle in the field. I can see poultry, maybe even some hog pens. But then I can watch the green. I can tell whether you like wheat or corn or what have you by what you're planting, because they come in at a season, different times.
Military commanders have long sought the high ground, but maintaining an eagle eye over enemy territory wasn't always so easy. Not until the invention of the balloon in France in 1783 did aerial reconnaissance literally take off. The French led the way, the first to take the balloon to war, using it in the Battle of Fleurus in Belgium in 1794 to observe the movements of enemy troops through a telescope. Superior intelligence led to victory. Nearly 70 years later, in 1861, observation balloons became a significant feature of the American Civil War, after several balloon enthusiasts volunteered for the front. Tethered balloons were too unstable for pioneer photography and were often clearly visible to the enemy. It wasn't long before soldiers started firing at them.
One day, one of the gunners aimed down the barrel of the gun and fired at the balloon. And this was in Falls Church, Virginia, and so that was the first use, really, of anti-aircraft artillery.
From then on, spies in the sky would be in constant danger of attack. Other means of spying were experimented with in the early 1900s, using cameras attached to pigeons, rockets, and kites. But none proved entirely satisfactory. If aerial spying took off with balloons, it would take a quantum leap forward with the first flight of the airplane in 1903. But military planners were slow to catch on to the value of aerial spying until the First World War.
It was very difficult initially in the early months of the war to actually convince general staff or generals or planners that the aeroplane actually had any advantage over current technologies. The current technology for reconnaissance, of course, being at the time the cavalry.
When the war became entrenched, both sides quickly realized they needed airplanes to see behind enemy lines. The British scored the first photo reconnaissance coup of the war at the Battle of the Marne in 1914. Photos of the German advance revealed that troops were totally unaware of their exposure to the British Army close by. The British successfully stemmed the German advance. Armies began to take notice of aerial photography. Neuve Chapelle in 1915 was the first battle planned using aerial photos of the site. The success was so great that from then on there was an urgent demand for tactical photo reconnaissance on a daily basis. The first fighter planes were developed to protect observation aircraft, leading to vicious dogfights in the air. Reconnaissance pilots struggled bravely against a multitude of other obstacles.
The glass plates that were used to capture the image were very delicate, of course, being glass, and just being put in and out of magazines, slid in and out of the aircraft in position. They quite often broke carried on their way to the photo lab. They were just very fragile.
For pilots flying in open cockpits at freezing temperatures, cameras were difficult to operate with numb hands.
All these things conspired to make the job even more difficult than it was when somebody was shooting at you, and it's actually remarkable that the perseverance of the crews actually won through, and a lot of these photographs came back at all.
By the end of World War I, thousands of aerial photos were being taken every day. But after the signing of the armistice in November 1918, interest in aerial photography soon diminished. Most people thought the Great War was the war to end all wars. Commanders neglected aerial photography. The plane was used for mapping, delivering the first airmail, and barnstorming, but not for spying. However, there was one man in the U.S. Army, Colonel George Goddard, who understood that in a future war, quality aerial photographs would be critical. Determined to eliminate blurred images, Goddard wanted a camera which could freeze an object when moving over it at speed. He found inspiration at the racetrack. From the concept of the photo finish camera, he created the strip camera.
We actually move the camera along. It has this slit, and naturally, as the airplane is moving along above the ground, we move the film past this slit at the rate of speed that these objects are passing by. And then we wind up with a strip of continuous film, which can be upward of 50 to 100 miles long.
Despite effective new technology, aerial spying was largely abandoned by all sides for much of the interwar period. Military planners were reluctant to finance long-term aerial reconnaissance. Both sides would pay dearly for this error at the beginning of World War II. In 1938, Nazi General Werner Freiherr von Fritsch predicted that the army with the best photographic reconnaissance would win the next war. In Britain, as early as 1934, the chiefs of staff were concerned by the German threat of war and had little or no intelligence on the German armed forces. Wing Commander Fred Winterbottom was appointed to the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, to investigate the Luftwaffe's activities. Winterbottom recruited a maverick Australian pilot, Sidney Cotton, for an undercover photo reconnaissance operation over Germany. Not only did he have a flair for adventure, Cotton also had the perfect cover. He was an able civilian pilot with a color film business which frequently took him to Berlin. In Cotton, Winterbottom created the godfather of modern photo intelligence. In 1938, using the cover of Heston, a commercial airport outside London, Cotton flew his Lockheed 12A at 20,000 feet, camouflaged in duck-egg blue paint and equipped with hidden cameras. Cotton devised secret ways to direct warm air from the engine over the cameras so they would operate at high altitudes. His photos of Luftwaffe bases revealed the mounting signs of war. Cotton's credo was to fly as high and fast as possible for reconnaissance. But the RAF, who lacked Cotton's expertise, was loath to listen to a civilian, particularly one as outspoken as Cotton.
We had to convince the powers that be, particularly in the Air Ministry at the time, to go down this road because there was a lot of opposition to allowing fighters to be used in a role that was not associated with air defense.
On the declaration of war, Churchill demanded intelligence on the whereabouts of the German fleet. The RAF was at a loss, but refused to loan Cotton a plane to try and take pictures himself. Undeterred and unauthorized, Cotton flew off and presented the required photos the next day to a stunned and furious Air Ministry. When the Fuhrer calmed down, Cotton was summoned back. An officer greeted him with the words, "So you're the person giving us all this trouble?" "No, sir," Cotton replied. "His name is Hitler." Cotton was then given carte blanche to run a top-secret photo reconnaissance unit out of Heston for the RAF. He immediately demanded their best aircraft for the job, the Supermarine Spitfire. Then the fastest plane in the world, it flew at 320 miles an hour. Pilots soon discovered the perils of the new approach.
We didn't understand about condensation trails. They were an absolute bugbear. If you left a contrail, you were just asking for trouble and inviting the enemy to shoot at you from the ground and to see you from his fighters.
On the 9th of April, 1940, one of Cotton's reconnaissance Spitfires flew the first sortie over Kiel, a port in northern Germany. British photo interpreters discovered a massive fleet of merchant ships.
At first, no one could explain this because obviously they hadn't seen anything beforehand. However, within 24 hours, they soon realized what the build-up was for. It was Hitler's invasion of Norway.
From then on, British would record many images over a duration of time rather than just taking a few for imminent operations. By June 1940, as Paris fell to the Germans, the RAF had had all it could take of Wing Commander Cotton. He was dismissed for frequently flouting authority. Underlying this excuse was the embarrassment Cotton had caused senior RAF and Air Ministry members by exposing their ineptitude. Sidney Cotton was gone, but his legacy to British photo intelligence was beyond dispute. As Hitler planned to invade England during the anxious days of September 1940, British codebreakers were still struggling to decrypt German communications. Aerial photos of the German invasion ports in France were the key source of intelligence for Churchill. They identified where the Germans were intensifying their forces, allowing Bomber Command to seriously disrupt the German fleet.
Without photographic reconnaissance, we'd have been very blind, and we'd have been acting on any sort of spoof information that the enemy might put up, because we wouldn't have been able to check it.
Photo confirmed became the seal of authenticity for intelligence reports. The powerhouse of the Allied photo interpretation effort was based at Danesfield House, Medmenham, a country mansion west of London. Close to 80% of all World War II British intelligence would be checked by photo reconnaissance. No operation would be undertaken without it. Interpreters scoured photos locating bombing targets and assessing bombing accuracy.
You can see just 4 sidings and empty wood, practically no traffic, no barges, and nothing. But now, look at it. Quite different. Greatly extended sidings, oil tanks along a row by this railway line, pipelines coming out of the wood where there are more installations, coming down to these barges in the river. It's very big. Certainly is a peach of a target, isn't it, sir?
American reconnaissance pilots quickly learned from the British and adopted the fastest available aircraft, choosing the B-38 Lightning designed by Lockheed. Germany had conducted extensive photo reconnaissance over the UK prior to the war. Despite being highly methodical, the Luftwaffe suffered heavily from its fascination with tactical objectives. The Germans were more interested in the immediate terrain awaiting their panzer tanks rather than the bigger picture of the war. After the Battle of Britain, the Germans lost air superiority over the UK and were frustrated in their reconnaissance efforts. For very sensitive targets in Europe, Allied interpreters requested closer coverage, placing reconnaissance pilots at extreme risk. Low-level sorties were called dicing missions. Pilots were thought to be dicing with death.
It was called dicing because you were right in there amongst the machine gun bullets, and it gave you a bit of glamour and fun amongst the chaps in the squadrons to talk like that.
In the autumn of 1941, squadron leader Tony Hill helped pinpoint the Germans' top-secret Würzburg radar site at Brunewald. This dicing photo helped the British capture the site, steal the radar, and gain vital intelligence for the radar war. Dicing missions weren't the only danger reconnaissance pilots encountered. They often flew alone, unarmed, for up to 6 hours over enemy territory. In the constant battle for better technology, pilots would frequently find themselves chased by aircraft that could outrun them and shoot them down. Pilots in slower aircraft could only survive by pulling away from their pursuers sharply at the very last second.
I had one episode with 4 Fokker-Wulfs, which I watched them for 5 minutes chasing me. I watched them very closely, and they gradually came up and up and up, and then they were there. And my head was in the blister. Looking back, we had a blister on each side, the cockpit, looking back at them, trying to say, shall I turn now, 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 now? And I pulled the stick in my back, full right rudder, whipped my head out of the blister, and a bullet went straight through it.
Reconnaissance pilots often stood out from other pilots in the mess. They were likely to be the most cavalier and independent figures. One reconnaissance ace, Adrian Warburton, stunned spectators who saw him crash land his plane and 20 minutes later take off in another aircraft, determined to get the mission done. In May 1941, the RAF started a series of reconnaissance sorties over Peenemünde in northern Germany, based on reports from agents that it might be a German research center.
Much to the Allies' horror, they discovered that the Germans were in fact developing rockets as had been suggested originally. And it was only this continuous cover that allowed the Allies to monitor the complete story of German rocket development.
After a V-2 rocket was spotted at Peenemünde in June 1943, the site was heavily bombed. From photos of the raid, Constance Babington Smith, by chance, discovered a V-1 rocket on a ramp. RAF Medmenham swung into action to find mobile V-1 launch sites. Many started to appear on the northern coast of France. The V-2 rocket sites, which had been moved to underground installations after the raid, became almost impossible to find. The greatest photo interpretation effort in history was applied to the preparations for Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings of June 6, 1944. Some 4 million prints were analyzed for the D-Day deception. Thousands were used to create planning and briefing models for every landing beach. Deception efforts were made to convince the Germans that other locations were being assessed from the air. For every flight over Normandy, 2 were flown over another location. Hitler became convinced that the invasion would come through the Pas-de-Calais in northern France.
A great deal of the actual work, looking at the beach gradients at low level before the landings took place, and this went on for a long time, but you had to do them all. You had to do with beaches all the way up to Holland.
The mammoth photo reconnaissance effort paid off. By VE Day, German General von Fritsch's prophecy had come true. A total of 15 million photos had been analyzed at RAF Medmenham during the entire war, and this intelligence had given the Allies a tremendous advantage. At the beginning of the war, it was viewed with indifference, but now photo reconnaissance was undeniably the single most important source of military intelligence. After the Berlin blockade in 1948, great fear grew in the West about the Soviet Union. When the Russians detonated their first nuclear bomb in 1949, the American and British intelligence communities knew very little about it. In late 1953, the West learned of the Soviet Bison, an intercontinental jet bomber. Now the Soviets had the ability to deliver nuclear weapons to the U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower was deeply concerned.
No one wants another Pearl Harbor. This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world.
The growing anxieties of the Cold War fueled a race for increased long-range weapons and more sophisticated spy technology to monitor the arms buildup. Strategic Air Command was demanding target information on ballistic missile sites in Russia, but Soviet society was so closed the CIA had little success in using agents to learn its secrets. It was decided that aerial strategic reconnaissance would be performed continuously, even during peacetime. However, it was clear that any overflights would be perceived as acts of military aggression. As a solution, Eisenhower proposed the Open Skies Initiative at the Geneva Summit in July 1955. In which the U.S. and the Soviet Union could conduct mutual aerial observation. That proposal was flatly rejected by Soviet Premier Khrushchev. A year earlier, Eisenhower had set up a secret panel of scientists to investigate means in which clandestine long-range reconnaissance over denied territory could be achieved. The first to become operational was Air Force Project Genitrix. High-altitude balloons were released from bases in England and Turkey in January 1956, with cameras encased in gondolas below. Carried by the jet stream, the balloons would float over Russia, take photographs, and be retrieved on the other side. Project Genetrix was a disaster. Of the 500 balloons launched, only 40 made it across and were retrieved in the Pacific. The rest were lost or shot down to the Soviets. The photos captured mostly cloud cover and bore little significant intelligence. The project was immediately scrapped just as a new CIA aircraft came online. On the 4th of July, 1956, Eisenhower authorized the first U-2 flight over the Soviet Union. Designed by the legendary Kelly Johnson at Lockheed Martin's top-secret skunk works in Burbank, California, the U-2 project was one of the most tightly held secrets in America. A generation ahead of anything ever developed, the U-2 was a lightweight, single-engine aircraft incapable of carrying any offensive payload. It did have a range of 2,200 miles and could fly at an altitude of over 75,000 feet.
One of the purposes behind the U-2 was to be stealthy, and it was the consensus of the scientists in America working on this project that the U-2 could not be detected by available radars in the Soviet Union.
However, the Soviets tracked the U-2 by radar from its very first overflight. All they lacked was a surface-to-air missile capable of shooting it down. The U-2's camera system was a marvel of modern technology.
Eastman Kodak had developed S-Tar. It's a tough plastic, thin, tough. And that meant that we could wrap a lot of film on a spool. In fact, the U-2 had 2 spools of film, each 5,000 feet long.
The camera's coverage was also impressive. In just 12 overflights, it could photograph the entire landmass of North America. Using the top floors of a rundown car dealership in Washington, D.C., the CIA installed a group of expert photo interpreters led by Art Lundahl to analyze the enormous yield of the U-2. Codenamed Automat, the project was so secret, only a handful of people knew of its existence.
Now you can imagine you had to screen the White House people too. When you went out there with a bag of photographs, you didn't talk to any White House person that you met, even though you may have known them. You went straight to Eisenhower's office.
Within months, the efforts of the U-2 and Automat paid high dividends. The big issue for Eisenhower was the bomber gap. The U.S. military was convinced the Soviets had more bombers.
The first 3 missions flew over Leningrad, Moscow, and all of the Ukrainian airfields. And when we analyzed the film, we could go to President Eisenhower and say, "Mr. President, there's no bomber gap."
Aerial reconnaissance exposed the military's error and gave Eisenhower the weapon of truth in assessing Soviet strength. Since 1957, Automat had also been watching a secret rocket launch site, later revealed to be the Baikonur Cosmodrome. From this site, the Soviets launched Sputnik in October 1957. The first ever man-made object to go into space orbit. The Soviets had now claimed the ultimate high ground. As well as being caught behind in the space race, the American intelligence community feared that nothing could stop the Russians from launching ICBMs with nuclear warheads, an attack which the U.S. lacked the technology to counter. The development of a spy satellite to locate ICBMs became a high priority. Top-secret CIA Project Corona was launched soon thereafter. Its cover story was the official Discoverer mission, a biomedical project carrying mice and monkeys into space. Its real mission was to send up a camera and retrieve the first photos from outer space.
But Lockheed, which was the primary contractor involved and integrated all the pieces, very few people were aware of the true nature of the machine, and only those that had to know were aware that it was a reconnaissance vehicle. Others believed the cover story.
Engineers persevered through many early launch failures. In a race against time, Corona matured just as time was running out for the U-2. On the 1st of May, 1960, U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, on a flight that would test the plane's endurance to the very limit. But Powers would never arrive at his destination in Norway. Over Sverdlovsk, he was shot down by the burst of a surface-to-air missile. Miraculously, he survived, bailing out at 15,000 feet. He elected not to take the cyanide pill which all U-2 pilots carried. The Cold War suddenly grew hotter. Khrushchev exhibited the wreckage, and Eisenhower was forced to admit to espionage. Powers was sentenced to 10 years prison in Moscow, but was released 2 years later in exchange for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel. However, on the very day of Powers' sentencing, another important headline made news. The Discoverer 14 satellite capsule was recovered in midair after re-entering the Earth's atmosphere.
August the 16th was a big day for us, and that was the recovery of a roll of film. Now, on that film, we got over 1 million square miles of Soviet coverage. In that one spool of film, we had more coverage of the Soviet Union than the U-2 in all of its flights.
Corona's first grainy images revolutionized intelligence collection. One CIA agent said that Corona could pick up more information in a day than their agents could collect in a year. The immediate task at Automat was to address the missile gap.
We knew beforehand that any strategic missile sites would have to be located near the rail lines, because the Soviet Union, the roads are very, very bad. And not only that, but you have a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment, and you had to have good roads to handle it, and you also had to have wide radius turns for it to be positioned in a silo.
Using these clues, Automat interpreters made an important discovery. The missile gap didn't exist. The intelligence community had estimated there were 250 Soviet missile sites. The photography showed there were only 15. Despite the inconvenience of recovery and the slow 2-week turnaround to receive interpreted images, the photos were of undeniable value. Eisenhower could take comfort in the calming effect of the photo intelligence, but missiles would soon become a nail-biting issue for his successor, President John F. Kennedy. The creation of the National Reconnaissance Office in 1960, which managed the sending of spy satellites into space, and the creation of NPIC, the National Photo Interpretation Center, in 1961, were both highly classified. President Kennedy made these programs even blacker by phasing out public rocket launches. Starting in 1962, all satellite reconnaissance programs at the NRO fell under the codename Keyhole. Over the next decade, the greatest challenge for satellite technology would be to return images in step with the rapid escalation of world events. In mid-October 1962, America was a nation at peace. Its citizens had no idea that they would stand on the edge of an international crisis which would escalate by the hour. The stakes were too enormous not to have up-to-the-minute photo intelligence, and state-of-the-art satellites would be left in the sidelines.
The president and other decision makers really needed to know what was going on in the Soviet Union and Cuba as close to as it happened as possible. and satellites didn't have that capability.
Instead, the U-2 and the RF-101 Voodoo spy planes headed for Cuba. Interpreters watched enormous loads of military equipment arriving in Cuba from the Soviet Union. On the 28th of August, 6 surface-to-air missile sites were found. Overflights were increased. More missile sites were found. Interpreters could scarcely believe their eyes. The Soviets were building enough nuclear missile sites to destroy the entire East Coast. NPIC director Art Lundahl was immediately summoned.
He confirmed what we were seeing. And he said, I don't want anybody to go home. He said, get any excuse that you can possibly imagine. Call your wives and just tell them that you're not coming home tonight.
President Kennedy returned from Chicago to manage the crisis. The military favored use of force to resolve the conflict, but Kennedy preferred diplomacy, ordering a naval blockade of Cuba. On the 22nd of October, he addressed the nation.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Meanwhile, action shifted to the United Nations with confrontations between Adlai Stevenson and Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The crisis reached a crescendo on the 27th of October. In the morning, briefings were prepared for Kennedy. All 24 medium-range ballistic missile sites, just 90 miles from U.S. soil, were operational, meaning that within 4 to 6 hours, missiles could be landing on America. Suddenly, at noon, a U-2 was shot down over Cuba. Was this the prelude to an all-out attack? That evening, Kennedy readied his troops in Florida. He knew from Corona that the U.S. held the nuclear advantage.
At that time, I called my wife and I said, if you get another call from me, put the kids in the car and strike out for Missouri. That's where my parents lived, because I was convinced that by morning we could have war.
The next day, word came that the Russians were pulling the missiles out. Kennedy immediately ordered overflights.
So we flew all over Cuba, and we didn't see any indication of dismantling. And President Kennedy was very calm. He said, well, give them another day.
They saw that Khrushchev had indeed backed down. The world breathed a sigh of relief. Further U-2 missions were flown to monitor the removal of the missiles. It was the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war. The crisis improved communication lines with the Soviets, but it didn't halt the production of ICBMs. As silos became smaller, satellite resolution had to increase. In 1963, the NRO launched the KH-7 and KH-8 Gambit program. These satellites had a resolution that could detect objects as small as 6 inches apart and could be used to magnify targets which Corona had initially detected. The KH-9, a successor to Corona, was launched in 1971.
It was able to photograph or produce an image which covered thousands of square miles. And it was able to do that at 2-foot resolution, which was 3 times better than anything Corona could do.
The Soviets launched their own satellite program in the 60s under the direction of rocket scientist Sergei Korolev. Unlike spy planes, satellites actually helped keep the Cold War under control. They operated in a region of outer space that was judged to be free and available for all to use. From the mid-60s, both sides began to use satellites to monitor bilateral arms treaties. Satellites would play a limited role for the U.S. in the Vietnam War. The three-canopy layer of jungle was too dense for them to penetrate. Instead, the intimate nature of the Vietnam jungle and the evolution of new aerial spy technologies led to a completely new type of war theater. A revolutionary breed of spy plane, the SR-71, or Blackbird, designed by Lockheed for the CIA, radically transformed aerial espionage. Flying faster than a bullet at over 2,000 miles an hour, at 85,000 feet, the SR-71 could easily escape anti-aircraft fire. With in-flight refueling, it had global range. A unique blend of style and utility, the SR-71 was an unrivaled reconnaissance asset. Using the latest sensor systems, it could photograph 100,000 square miles every hour and pick out objects invisible to the human eye at 50 feet. On board, infrared imagery was critical for detecting movements of equipment and supplies.
The infrared spectrum allows you to detect heat, so that you can see if an aircraft has recently started its engines and moved away from the hard pan by the fact that you have a burn mark, in effect, that comes out on the imagery.
It's said that thermal imaging detectors in Vietnam were so sensitive they could pick out footprints in the jungle at night. Multispectral photography was developed as a camouflage detection capability. Vegetation containing chlorophyll will show up as bright red on this film, but fades as soon as the vegetation has been cut, when the chlorophyll content immediately decreases. Anything red will soon turn to pink, then black. Dead branches concealing vehicles become easy to spot. Back at the CIA, photo intelligence was used at the Fine-Scale Models Shop, a division of NPIC. Overhead photos helped create mock-ups used for planning raids. Model makers were tasked to work at great speed and under strict secrecy.
We basically shut ourselves up in a room by ourselves, and nobody in the building or anyone else could come in that room while we were working on this model. And of course, we could not talk about the model to anyone else besides the requester.
The model scale had to be absolutely accurate. Trees had to be in the right position, walls the correct height and thickness. Lives depended on this precision. Model makers frequently never knew what it was they were modeling, but they always knew their work was of extreme importance.
You had no idea where the location was, whether it be a site or a complex or a terrain model. That's information you never received, and basically you didn't ask.
Good strategic intelligence was quickly made available to commanders in Vietnam, but the primary concern at the NRO in Washington was still the time lag of satellite imagery. The Arab-Israeli Six-Day War in 1967 and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 gave chilling illustration of the problem. Satellite imagery from both events arrived weeks after each crisis had occurred. In 1977, the KH-11 was launched. The day after President Carter's inauguration, on the 21st of January 1977, he inspected the first images to be digitally relayed from space in almost real time. With the combination of the U-2, SR-71, and satellites, no corner of the world was too remote to spy on. And with the real-time KH-11, decision-makers could monitor events anywhere in view of the satellite within an hour of its occurrence. Only the people with the highest security clearance had access to satellite imagery, the most powerful national security asset. But the curtain of secrecy was ripped aside when former CIA employee William Campiles sold the KH-11 manual to the Soviets in March 1978 for only $5,000. If the Soviets didn't already have real-time technology then, they soon would. Spy imagery delivered powerful intelligence. In 1983, this satellite photo uncovered a Soviet radar under construction at Krasnoyarsk in violation of an international treaty. In the mid-80s, the space shuttle took new spy technology into orbit. In January 1986, the ill-fated Challenger made an astonishing discovery. Its new radar beams could penetrate 15 feet under the sand, revealing irrigation systems and trade routes in the Sahara thousands of years old. In the same year, spy satellites exposed the truth of the Chernobyl disaster at a nuclear power plant. Thermal imagery indicated that other reactors were still operational. Russian reports insisted they'd been shut down. The red spot shows heat emanating from the burning reactor. In 1988, Space Shuttle Atlantis launched the first Lacrosse satellite, giving the U.S. the first all-weather radar imaging capability from space. In 1986, in France, SPOT, the first civilian imaging satellite system, was launched. It could observe huge portions of territory at 1-meter resolution. Despite its own advanced spy satellite systems, America had to turn to spot imagery for support during the Gulf War in 1991. The immediate needs of commanders in the field suffered as American satellite imagery had always been funneled to Washington for long-term strategic use. The KH-11 couldn't adequately cover the entire battlefield at one time. Imagery distribution systems were woefully inadequate.
You had 14 different systems in the field, and they didn't all talk to each other. So, say the Air Force might get a photo, and it couldn't necessarily send it on to a Navy or an Army site because the systems weren't compatible.
Hard copies of images were physically couriered to different forces by helicopter. In some cases, the time lag was even longer than it had been in Vietnam. French spot imagery filled the gap which the U.S. satellite systems left open. It was used for vital planning missions where pilots could rehearse in overflying their targets. For imagery analysts, pictures of desert battles offered unique intelligence.
After a battle is over with, you can literally analyze the battle, because the vehicles have all left their marks, and you can see who was advancing, who was retreating, and how the battle was fought.
On the ground, remotely piloted vehicles were critical for commanders in providing short-range tactical reconnaissance. Launched from land or sea, RPVs were so successful in Desert Storm that often the Iraqis surrendered to them, knowing that an attack would inevitably soon follow. New hand-launched RPVs are at the cutting edge of tactical reconnaissance assets. Technology quickly responded to the lessons of the Gulf. Imagery is now digitized wherever possible. Getting real-time pictures to field commanders rapidly is imperative.
We've actually gotten to the point where that U-2 can send that imagery directly into the cockpit of a fighter aircraft or of another surveillance aircraft.
Now China, Israel, and France have joined the U.S. and Russia in launching spy satellites, and commercial satellite imagery is now readily available for a price.
There will be a whole variety of countries and people or organizations throughout the world who will now have access to what would have been considered spy satellite quality imagery that they could never have hoped to have gotten a few years ago.
Ironically, the very technology which once provided national security may be used by radical groups to identify targets of opportunity. Today, spy satellites are still the ultimate intelligence resource. It is said they can read car license plates and newspaper print from hundreds of miles up in space. These are a nation's most dedicated spies. They never sleep, and they never defect. The limits to spying on Earth may soon be reached, but oceans of space wait for man to explore as he continues to conquer new ground. In the future, even if battles are fought in space, there will always be an eye in the sky stealing secrets and beaming them back from beyond.